In the early 1700s, deep in the forbidden wilderness of East Texas, the French colonial military built a ghost. It wasn't a grand stone castle built to project royal majesty, it was a hidden outpost known as Fort Le Dout, the redoubt. A redoubt is a small enclosed fort. Unlike a massive stone fortress built to hold an entire army, a redoubt was typically a low-profile, compact wooden palisade designed for total secrecy and a 360-degree defense. Frontier redoubts were typically hastily assembled using military doctrines of the time and featured a winding entry with switchback walls to provide a more defensible bottleneck at the entrance. The fortifications were designed to keep a small garrison safe on all sides while commanding a hidden choke point deep in the wilderness. Fort Le Dout was an illegal deep woods trading post built for a single illicit purpose: to siphon thousands of valuable Indian trade beads, pottery, deer hides, and peltry right out from underneath the prying eyes of Spanish patrols. This was a territory Spain had declared strictly off limits to foreign traders. And for a time, it was a place of lucrative black market trade, operating deep within a highly contested area of the Louisiana-Texas frontier. And then, the French stopped reporting in. In an era with zero rapid communication, a missed check-in wasn't an immediate cause for concern. Commanders routinely anticipated rational delays due to seasonal flooding, torrential storms, or other problems, leaving significant leeway on report intervals. The commander at Natchitoches likely waited days, if not weeks, to give the silent outpost the benefit of the doubt. But when the silence stretched past the point of rational delay, the commander was out of patience. A scouting party was then dispatched into the forest with orders to investigate what was going on at Fort Le Dout and report back quickly. After a few weeks came and went, that initial scouting party also failed to return. As concerns rose, a second, more capable cavalry detachment was ordered to find the fort and get to the bottom of things. This is where the story takes a dark turn. Frontier lore claims that when the garrison finally cleared the tree line, they found the fort abandoned. The wooden walls were standing, the gates were intact but just swinging open, and no lookouts were posted. There was also no sign of the original garrison or of the scouting party that had been sent to investigate. The only thing they found inside the silent redoubt was a single starving horse tied to a post in the mud. It's a haunting piece of oral history to be sure, but as a statement of fact it raises immediate red flags. In the study of the American frontier, the tale of an intact outpost left with a single starving animal is a recognizable folklore trope. It's a narrative device that precisely mirrors other famous sudden colonial disappearances. Most notably the 1702 abandonment of Fort Louisiana in the upper Mississippi wilderness area of Minnesota. Like some kind of eerie campfire ghost story passed down through the ages. Today, official Texas historical markers say the case is closed. They claim that Fort Le Dout was permanently swallowed up and lost forever when the Lake Fork Reservoir was impounded in 1980. But the geography and known facts tell a different story. Decades later, a collection of systematically destroyed French military hardware was pulled out of a muddy creek bed 12 miles away from the reservoir. Let's talk about what we know, cover the facts in the official records, and you can decide for yourself what you think happened. I'm not the judge, I'm just the investigator. This is the story of Fort Le Dout, the outpost built to be invisible, and the enduring mystery of a frontier garrison that walked deep into the East Texas piney woods and never returned. To understand how a bunch of 18th century French military weapons ended up in an East Texas creek bed, the timeline rolls back to early 1700s. The French in Louisiana and the Spanish in Texas were locked in a high-stakes, quiet game of imperial chess. Spain asserted absolute territorial sovereignty over Texas and strictly prohibited foreign merchants to prevent people from trading guns to the Caddo and Wichita Indians. The Spanish meant it too. The penalty for trading across this boundary was serious. The Spanish were known to imprison such black market merchants, seizing all of their trade goods, and after a speedy trial the penalty was usually death or a lifetime of hard labor. No exceptions were given at the time. However, French-Canadian traders like Louis de Saint-Denis built entire careers on bypassing Spanish borders and establishing clandestine illegal posts deep within this contested territory. To maintain these black market networks, traders required remote interior hubs, places that were tucked so deep into the river bottom backwoods that Spanish patrols would rarely venture to look. They required complete isolation, and they found that in the dense bottomlands feeding the upper Sabine River watershed. Journals left by explorers from the time consistently emphasized the sheer hostility of the landscape. Jean-Baptiste Bernard de la Harpe, navigating the Louisiana-Texas frontier in 1719, described the region as an almost impassable tangled thicket of flooded timber and stagnant water. Disease, intense heat, suffocating humidity, parasites, snakes, alligators, and total isolation were constant deadly variables for the men stationed at these woodland posts. For a frontier garrison, survival depended entirely on remaining hidden. They were completely cut off from the outside world in a landscape that served as its own natural defense. The profound scarcity of corroborating paperwork within formal European archives isn't an accident, it was intentional. Fort Le Dout operated under the autonomous authority of the French Minister of Marine, who held jurisdiction over overseas trade, naval assets, and colonial logistics of the frontier. This administrative framework exempted frontier outposts from French military oversight and granted local commanders extraordinary operational discretion. This also allowed for plausible deniability. By maintaining a shadow profile, the French crown could credibly disavow the post's activities whenever Spanish border patrols discovered any contraband operations. They could believably dismiss the outpost as an unauthorized camp of black market smugglers. The men on the ground would be completely on their own, and they knew it. The physical trail reopens around 1870 near present-day Haynesville, Texas, at a location known as Mill Race Creek. A mill race is a hand-dug canal or ditch designed to divert water from natural streams or rivers directly to a water wheel to generate mechanical power for a mill. A local pioneer named Christian Haynes, one of the original settlers of the town of Haynesville, hired a crew of laborers to excavate a water race through the Lake Fork Creek system to power his new timber mill. As the ditch diggers cleared the heavy muck of the creek bed, their tools struck a deposit of historic iron. Old records from this time say that the men unearthed enough smashed flintlocks to cover the entire bottom of a wagon bed. People on the frontier didn't waste things like firearms, or forged metal. Obtaining them was difficult, dangerous, and expensive. At bare minimum, the weapon parts would have been highly tradable and extremely valuable on the wilderness frontier. Under normal circumstances, the metal from these guns would have been salvaged, traded, or repurposed. Finding them systematically destroyed and discarded implies an unusual situation, such as a tactical retreat by the French garrison. The formal archaeological record eventually documented at least 25 of these weapons. They were identified specifically as Type D French fusils, which is a type of light flintlock musket manufactured in France at the Toulay Arsenal between 1730 and 1765, specifically for frontier and militia deployment. They were commonly referred to as trade guns. The destroyed weapons were found buried alongside iron hatchets, trade knives, an estimated 1,500 glass trade beads, and one ornate copper cross explicitly engraved with the Spanish words for Holy Mother. A final discovery from this same period adds a chilling human element to the place. In 1874, those same laborers excavating the mill race uncovered an unmarked burial at the adjacent Joe Moody farm. The individual was identified as Caucasian by the local doctor and had been interred inside a crude coffin hewn from split logs. The burial was determined to predate the Anglo-American settlement of the Haynesville area, which didn't begin until around 1841. Local lore eventually tried to attach the burial to La Salle, the French explorer murdered in East Texas in 1687, but that was later dismissed by modern scholars who placed La Salle's death near the Trinity River, 120 miles to the south. But the identification of a pre-settlement Caucasian grave of someone buried so close to a deposit of scuttled French weapons remains a haunting detail that history has never fully accounted for. As the decades pass, the swamp does what it does best. it reclaimed literally everything. By 1958, professional researchers explicitly set out to locate and map the exact area where the weapons had been found. The expedition was led by Lothiel F. Duffield, a prominent archaeologist contracted with the University of Texas at Austin, known to his peers as Duff. Alongside him was Sam Whiteside, a legendary regional field investigator who was known for his work at Native American sites all up and down the Sabine River Valley. But even with the combined expertise of the two men, they were completely unable to relocate the creek coordinates. The dense understory of briars and swamp growth had already swallowed the physical evidence, leaving the location unable to be verified, and the official report notes exactly that. It would take another 30 years for researchers to successfully pierce the tree line. Between 1987 and 1988, researchers Bob Skiles and Timothy Pertula conducted a formal survey of the area, finally recording the official location as the Woldort site, carrying the Texas Archaeological Registry designation of 41WD333. When evaluating a deposit of trade goods and antique firearms in East Texas, standard archaeological frameworks often look towards indigenous trading encampments of the Navajo-Caddo. To weigh this theory accurately, it's useful to look closely at the known lifestyle and building practices of the Caddo people. The Caddo Indians were a highly sophisticated, sedentary agricultural civilization. For hundreds of years, they constructed permanent villages exclusively on selected alluvial terraces. They would choose elevated, well-drained high ground near major rivers that they could reliably use to support heavy crops like maize, beans, and squash. Their settlements were permanent, deliberate, and built for long-term habitation where farming concerns were a factor. By comparison, the environment of the Millrace Creek drainage presents a completely different landscape. This specific terrain is seasonally flooded, semi-permanently waterlogged, and bottomland. The late 1980s intensive survey explicitly noted that this floodplain inundates too frequently and unpredictably to support long-term permanent domestic habitation. Historically, the major Caddo confederacies maintained their permanent towns further north along the Red River or to the south in the Neches and Angelina valleys. This geographical reality leaves us with a massive open question. If the region's native agriculturalists traditionally bypassed low-lying flood-prone bottomlands with their permanent settlements, what alternative explanation accounts for 25 French military muskets left deep inside this exact swamp? Traditional historians have frequently raised skepticism about the fort, citing the lack of visible ruins of the site. However, this line of reasoning entirely overlooks the military protocols of the 18th century French frontier. During this era, French military architecture reserved expensive stone masonry exclusively for massive, crown-funded imperial strongholds that were situated along major maritime shipping lanes, such as the fortress of Louisbourg or the later limestone iterations of Fort Chartres on the Mississippi. For stone to be logistically viable at an outpost, a strict set of conditions had to be met first: immediate proximity to an active quarry, an extensive royal treasury attached to it, and deep-water naval access capable of moving massive flatboats laden with tons of rock. On the isolated East Texas frontier, hundreds of miles from coastal water supply routes and deep within a waterlogged bottomland woodland, transporting quarried stone was entirely impractical. Furthermore, this unauthorized outpost operated deep behind enemy lines. Even if a clandestine garrison could somehow haul tons of stone past Spanish guards and into a waterlogged forest thicket, stabilizing heavy masonry foundations in the shifting bottomland muck would have been practically impossible. In fact, it would be difficult to build such a structure there now in modern times, even with heavy equipment, making it even more unlikely in the 1720s. Consequently, the French interior trading posts and defensive redoubts that were built in surrounding areas were constructed out of local timber. We see this exact footprint at the nearby Nasonite post further up the river basin, and in the early crude wood and mud fortifications of Fort St. Jean Baptiste at Natchitoches. Even across the Spanish line, the Empire relied on basic wood picket palisades, like the ill-fated mission at San Francisco de las Tejas. They utilized vertical split log palisades or horizontal logs chinked with mud. Inside the acidic and seasonably flooded soils of the Sabine River Basin, organic wood would completely decompose over 2.5 centuries, disappearing into the soil and leaving no traces other than perhaps faint rings in the sand. Even these sediment rings from wooden pillars that had decomposed over time would be next to impossible to locate in the swampy terrain covered with rapidly growing scrub oak. In these conditions, the only components of an outpost capable of surviving the centuries were the heavy iron parts of the weapons found beneath the mud, and even then the reports indicate that the metal was highly degraded. In their late 1980s analysis, researchers considered whether the firearms represented a simple trade storage deposit or whether the barrels were accidentally damaged by agricultural work and ditch digging in the late 19th century. However, primary accounts from the local community introduced a completely different detail. Archived print records from the Wood County Democrat in 1908 explicitly noted that the recovered musket barrels were uniformly bent, battered, and broken in two prior to their retrieval. They were not randomly damaged, but consistently and systematically destroyed. From a materials perspective, an 18th century French iron barrel is remarkably tough. Random shovel strikes during a 19th century ditch excavation would produce inconsistent incidental damage. A nick here, a crack there. Uniform destruction across at least 25 weapons tells the story of deliberate human intent. Standard 18th century French frontier doctrine strictly required a garrison to completely destroy its own armory if a post became untenable, thus preventing usable weaponry from falling into the hands of rivals. This tactical scuttling was widely documented at major outposts like Fort Duquesne in 1758 and Fort Carillon in 1759. And in every documented historical case, that destruction happened in place at the fort itself. A garrison destroyed what they could not carry and then withdrew. The weapons stayed exactly where the fort stood. Traditional state maps place Fort Le Dout 12 miles away near the main channel of the Sabine River. But the sheer weight of these weapons challenges that geography. Consider the practical reality. A Type D French fusil was a significant, heavy asset. A garrison facing an untenable situation has rational options: take the weapons with them, trade them off before withdrawing them, or destroy them in place. What a garrison would almost certainly not do is load a wagon bed full of heavy iron firearms and haul them 12 miles through waterlogged bottomland forest, only to destroy them and dump them in a random creek bed. If the weapons were scuttled in accordance with military doctrine, they were destroyed right where they sat. This means the creek bed wasn't just a random disposal site. This was the actual location of Fort Le Dout. The traditional state maps were wrong, and the fort was at Mill Race Creek where the guns were found. This logic eliminates the other historical players. Could the Spanish have seized the weapons and destroyed them? Documented Spanish protocols on the Texas frontier were strictly focused on arrest and confiscation, as famously seen in the Blancpain case of 1754. Spanish forces capturing French contraband typically seized weapons as evidence and trophies. Live French prisoners were easier to interrogate, and functional European firearms held a massive tactical and diplomatic leverage point for the Spanish crown. Killing the French at the fort and smashing the guns into a creek bed served absolutely no strategic interest to the Spanish and ran counter to typical orders of the time. We can also rule out native destruction. The 1908 Wood County Democrat offered an early theory that local Indians destroyed the firearms out of superstitious fear. But we can dismiss that right out of hand. The archaeological report by Pertula and Skiles noted that none of the Waldorf barrels showed the characteristic reworking consistently found at native sites, where prized gunmetal was carefully repurposed into scrapers, diggers, knives, and tools. The Caddo and Wichita Indians knew the value of firearms very well, and in fact that's why Fort Le Dout was created to begin with. To the Indians, every piece of forged iron held immense practical value. Destroying it and leaving it in a mud ditch runs entirely counter to the realities of frontier life. The evidence points squarely back at the French garrison, destroying their armory in place before abandoning a post that had become untenable. But it leaves us with the ultimate mystery. If this was a withdrawal, where did the men go? A disciplined military evacuation leaves a paper trail. Contact with Natchitoches would have been re-established, the garrison accounted for and reassigned, and it would appear in French military journals. Instead, the historical record goes completely silent. The answer isn't a human enemy. The ambush was the environment itself. The East Texas bottomlands are brutally hostile, heavily ridden with ticks, chiggers, snakes, oppressive heat, high humidity, and stagnant water. Most importantly, it was a lethal disease environment serving as a vector for endemic illnesses, most notably malaria and viral encephalitis. Typhoid and malaria of the mosquito and tick-borne varieties were a commonplace problem in this area at the time, and had eventually led to the Caddo Indians abandoning some of their own settlements. Advanced typhoid and malaria do not merely cause physical weakness. They produce severe, incapacitating delirium, profound hallucinations, and a total collapse of cognitive ability. The gravesite identified in the 1874 Caucasian burial on the adjacent farm tells the final tragic timeline. A split-log coffin is a hasty field burial. It proves that at least one companion survived long enough to lay a fellow soldier to rest in frontier fashion. Then, the remaining survivors stepped back into the timber, completely disoriented by fever, and were never seen again. Imagine a small, independent garrison of 8 to 20 French infantrymen, already weakened by months of grueling frontier posting, attempting a rapid retreat through a trackless wetland in the stifling summer heat. As the fever took hold, the men would have lost the ability to navigate. They would have become profoundly disoriented, lost, and physically incapacitated within the dense choking canopy. The physical evidence makes one thing clear. Something irreversible happened in these woods, and whoever was involved left in a hurry, or they did not leave at all. The facts remain permanently preserved in the land, an environment entirely unsuitable for traditional native agriculture, a collection of uniformly destroyed firearms found right where they were scuttled, a garrison that never reported in again, and a pre-settlement Caucasian burial interred in a hewn log coffin. The interpretation of these facts is left to history, but the questions are compounded. Does a collection of systematically destroyed 18th century French military flintlocks confirm the location of a lost redoubt and mark the final chapter of the men who built it? Or does the evidence point to something else entirely? Leave your thoughts or theories in the comments. We read every comment and would like to know what you think. If you enjoyed or got value from this video, please like and subscribe to help support our research. Thank you for watching.